Joining us now, staff writer for The New Yorker's Letter from Trump's Washington, Susan Glasser, and columnist at The Daily Beast, David Rothkopf. Mr. Rothkopf is host of the Deep State Radio podcast. All right, so, David, I'm actually going to start with you on this because if we're talking about Israel, we're going to talk about Israel and Ukraine. If Donald Trump is to win, he's promised to end the war in Ukraine in one day. And the consensus, because he's not said this affirmatively, the consensus is that he would hand over Ukraine to Russia or try to do that. He hasn't said he wants Ukraine to win. And then on Israel, you know, we have the Biden administration, Harris, talking about a two-state solution. That's the only way forward. I don't know that we can say definitively that Trump wants a two-state solution. Just on those two fronts, a Trump win would be massively consequential.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's why, although the president's speech was measured and valedictory in tone, it was, as was just pointed out, political in subtext, because the objectives that were laid out by Biden with regard to continuing to support Ukraine or supporting a sustainable peace in the Middle East will only be achieved if Kamala Harris is elected president. Donald Trump has said twice in the past 24 hours that he thinks the United States should be out of Ukraine. Of course, he says that despite the fact that we're not actually in Ukraine, but that we should stop supporting Ukraine, and that he pointed out that Russia wins wars, you know, and they're going to win this war. And of course, that's not only defeatist, it's historically wrong. And I think it's very clear that Trump and Netanyahu have this kind of mutual admiration society. Both of them want to stay out of jail and are willing to give each other a blank check in order to do that. So I think Biden's message was, if you want peace and if you want stability, ultimately the American people are going to have to choose Kamala Harris.
Susan, what is your take on the decision at hand and the consequences?
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously the space for diplomacy is vanishingly thin at this point before the U.S. election. I think it's important to have a reality check there. The Biden administration has worked relentlessly over the nearly 1 year since October 7th in hopes of achieving a ceasefire, in hopes of achieving another round of a hostage deal. I think both of those are increasingly unlikely at any point before the U.S. election, or possibly even in the remainder of Biden's term. The U.S. election, as David pointed out, is a foreign policy election, whether we talk about it or not, because the consequences, regardless of what the candidates actually say on the campaign trail, the consequences will be felt in quite a radically different way in terms of the U.S. position in the world. There's no bigger difference, it seems to me, than the difference between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on Ukraine. You know, the Trump position seems to be that he's going to wave a magic wand and end the war in 24 hours. This is quite simply absurd. And as with a lot of American discussion of the war in Ukraine, it doesn't factor Ukraine into the mix, never mind Ukraine's immediate neighbors, such as Poland, who would never accept just laying down one's arms in order to satisfy the terms of a Donald Trump negotiated, you know, sellout to Russia. So I just think we're sort of having either a non-conversation or a fantasy conversation about Ukraine and what's possible. But it really underscores the extent to which it's not possible to do very much in foreign policy before this election resolves where America is going to stand in the world.
Yeah, on that subject, Mike, there's so little time left before the election. President Biden really wants there to be a peace deal, yes, a ceasefire deal between Hamas and Gaza. The Qatari emir said he doesn't have a negotiating partner in Israel. I've heard that from a lot of major foreign officials and U.S. officials, that it doesn't seem like Netanyahu is there at all. Also, they don't really have much of a negotiating partner with Sinwar either. The word is that Biden has said to his staff, work effing harder. I read that in a report from one of our...
He's always been a tough boss and uses that kind of language.
Yeah, of course. So when they're working effing harder, what do they do? What is possible? What do they think is still possible in this remaining time?
I can imagine, Jake Sullivan, John Feiner, Tony Blinken thinking we're working pretty damn hard already. Yeah. And you can look at the travel schedule they've been on.
William Burns.
Exactly. Yeah. They've been relentless. I think part of the sense, frankly, in the White House is that our election may need to be seen through before the Israelis, but also they've been putting a lot of public pressure, at least right now, on Sinwar, right? I mean, Hamas has to agree to this as well. And so I think the language, and Jake Sullivan is fond these days of quoting George Mitchell, former Senate Majority Leader, longtime diplomat, and saying you're going to have 1,000 days of failure before you have your 1 day of success. I think they do think there might be some openings after the election. It might depend on what the result is, of course.
What about Kamala Harris? David, do you have an idea of what her foreign policy would be?
Well, I think we do have a good idea. She's been practicing foreign policy for the past 3.5 years. She's given speeches on it in Munich 3 times. She's talked a lot about what the end game for the war in Gaza would be. In fact, I think her remarks on that have been pretty formative. But, with regard to the issues we're talking about here and what Mike and Susan have said, she is certainly behind staying in Ukraine. She's met with Zelensky 6 times. She is absolutely committed to maintaining the course there, which is critical. And she's said repeatedly that she supports Israel's right to defend itself, that she seeks the release of the hostages, and that she seeks not only a ceasefire, but the framework for a lasting peace. That works both for the people of Israel and for the Palestinian people. And I think she'll work at that. The one thing that I would throw into the mix here, though, is the period between the election and the inauguration of a new president is a period where the sitting president, where President Biden can undertake certain steps that might be a little politically risky. He could, for example, provide support for Ukraine to use weapons deeper into Russia. He could put more pressure onto Netanyahu. And I think those are the kind of things that he's likely to try to do to both burnish his reputation between now and then, but also to move the ball down the field in a way only he can during the remainder period of his presidency.
Susan, the subject of Israel and President Biden's support of Israel has been a problem for Democrats on the campaign trail because it's meant that large Arab populations in some key places like Michigan have become very skeptical of Biden. And Kamala Harris is finding they're pretty skeptical of her, too. How does she try to address the issue of Israel and Gaza to get back that support while maintaining the support of Jewish Americans and those who support Israel here in America?
Yeah, I think that's why Prime Minister Netanyahu has the Democrats in a pretty tight spot. As David said, he seems to be once again kind of fusing his interests with the interests of Donald Trump. I think if there was something he could do to outright get Donald Trump elected, it seems that he would do so in this. And the problem, of course, is that the situation on the ground in Israel is such that it seems very unlikely at this point that there's going to be a major ceasefire or a deal before the election. That puts Vice President Harris in a difficult position. I think she's navigated it pretty well, and from a political sense, there was an initial sense that even though she didn't break with President Biden's policy in any overt way, that her emphasis perhaps was somewhat different. She has definitely made a focus of talking about her concern for civilian populations, of Palestinians impacted by the conflict, but they don't have a good answer. I mean, that's just the bottom line. They do not have a good answer where they can say, we're going to do X or Y, because their efforts to produce different outcomes on the ground not only have not produced the hostage deal and ceasefire, but at this point, Netanyahu has been ignoring President Biden's pleas in a very public way for quite a long time. So at this point, short of cutting off the weapons, I'm not sure, what else Harris and Biden can do before the election.